We all know the Mount and Blade community has ushered in a massive variety of new titles. Holdfast Nations at War, Battle Cry of Freedom, War of Rise, all coming from a modding background originating from Mount and Blade. They then go on to create standalone titles of themselves that are all decent and have great attributes in their own right. And this is just the newest. We Who Are About to Die is an arena brawler. You take the part of a gladiator, and yes, it's pretty much an RPG. It advertises itself as a strategy RPG action roguelike. Fight and strategize your way through spectacles and arenas. You can rise from a lowly slave to a grand champion to earn your freedom. There's quite a lot to this, so I thought I'd get into it and give it a good, decent review. However, I have actually spoken to the developer himself and talked a little bit about his background. He started modding all the way back in 2006. Just the original Mount and Blade, then leading on to study at game dev school to become a game developer. And this is what's incredible. Whilst this game has its issues, and I will get onto it, this is a solo development title, and this seems to be coming up and up again. These really fascinating and interesting unique ideas that are coming about from just one person that had that idea in the first place. The game is still currently in early access, but I think we should probably jump into it. First of all, you start at a training camp, giving you a decent idea of how the mechanics of the game is going to work. It is very much based entirely in the arenas, just with upgrading your troop or your character as time goes on. You'll instantly notice that the game is pretty goddamn nice looking. It has a nice mix of cartoony and realistic styles. It has a lot of gore, as we'll get onto a little bit later, but a solid 7.5 out of 10 for graphics, at least to start with. Although one thing I did notice, it's not the best optimized. Even on a 3090, we're hanging at around 50 FPS, which I'd kind of like to see a bit more squeezed out of that. The tutorial is a decent way of showing you everything that the game has to offer, from throwing weapons to using the basic combat system and the movement systems. You'll go through each of the paddocks and it'll give you a little tutorial and you can try it out for as long as you want. One thing I really like about this is that you don't have to spend ages just going through and completing set missions. If you don't want to do a tutorial, just skip on to the next one or run through the entire training camp and don't do any of them. You probably will be a little bit worse for wear when it comes to putting you on the battlefield, but hey, it gives you that choice. As you can tell, being developed by an ex-Mount and Blade modder, this takes that Mount and Blade directional based combat. It does it a little bit differently, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. However, directional based attacks and defense. It is target based, which is a little bit fiddly. I kind of like with this kind of thing to have more free flowing. Free flowing is something like Mount and Blade Warband, where you just choose your swing direction and choose your defense direction. You don't have to target a certain troop. Kingdom Come Deliverance is one that has targeted based combat, and there have been a lot of controversies over that combat in the past. Whilst that is in this game, I can kind of see why from that top down perspective that we're getting, but I'm not sure it's the best for the smoothest kind of gameplay. There is some really cool physics based momentum, however. For example, throwing weapons does have some cool unique touches. Instead of pressing a button to throw a weapon, you have drop weapon. Whether it's Q or E depends on which hand you drop from, but if you drop a weapon as you're mid-swing, it will then be thrown. This means there's a lot of timing to it. This also means that it's pretty much useless. You'll probably never need to throw your weapons because, wow, getting an actual weapon throw and to get the sword aiming the right way to hit an enemy, that's going to be a lucky shot, or take a lot of time and skill. I do like the uniqueness of making it more physics based. However, with it does come the drawbacks of making it incredibly hard to actually use, at least in an effective scenario. Even in training, it was really hard just to throw axes and spears at a target, let alone in the heat of battle when you're trying not to get decapitated by a man in the other corner. So we've done training. Well, let's head into our first battle. First things first, you can see is you're introduced to a bit of a survival. You start by killing off one guy, and once you've done that, many come out with teammates and enemies alike. You will notice that graphically, they've really been emphasizing on the gore aspect. Decapitations, limb amputations, getting stabbed in the face and bits and pieces rolling off. You can also be disarmed if you're hit in the correct place, and with the stamina system, that can also come into an effect. With stamina, it's used up every time you dodge, hit, block, that kind of thing, and I do notice it gets depleted a little bit too fast for my liking, but that's when it comes into the RPG elements. You see, the game is full of them. Everything from having skills and traits, unlocking new arms and armor to use in the arena. You have an almost lottery-based unlocking system. I guess that's the best way to describe it. There's 3 options to start with, and you can click to reveal what they are. They could be anything from common pelt armor to heavy myrmidon armor, and you can choose to buy them if you have the resources or you want to, or you just let them go. If you pay a bit of money, you can hold those arms and armor in place until you get the funds to buy them. But hey, I didn't have the money to do that at that point in time, so I just had to wave them goodbye and go into my next battle just as naked as before. Other RPG aspects are things like health. This is carried on through each match. You don't just automatically regenerate when you come out of an arena brawl. You have to make sure you go and see the physician, and then you can start to regain your health before going into the next one. There's a whole favor mechanic. This means that when you're in battles, not only do you have to try and survive, but you also have to perform. You need to make sure you're always facing an enemy if you can help it, and taking them down with slick and imaginative ways. Your public favor will go up and down in a slider in the right hand corner, and you'll see if the crowd start to like you. If they do, you'll get more XP and rewards from it, which can help you in the RPG elements. There are also patrons. You can fight for certain people in order to earn their favor, and I'm assuming in the later game they'll be able to give you resources or money to buy better arms and armor to make yourself better equipped for the bloody battles to come. We then head into a pit fight. It's a little bit more insane. It feels like we've been thrust as a slave into the botanic parts of the Empire, and my god, is it muddy, wet, and just like Liverpool at this time of the year. You're fighting through multiple enemies, and this is where the stamina system really comes into its own. Or as I mentioned, it's really when it starts to become frustrating. I run out of it almost indefinitely at this early part in the game, so you really have to make sure you're managing it. Make sure that you're not just blocking and dodging all the time, pulling yourself out of that battle before your stamina's regenerated. It kind of paces the battles a bit better, and it adds a new dynamic tactical element to it. This, alongside the favor, means that, yeah, you're going to have to pull yourself out of a duel to regen your stamina, which means the favor of the crowd is going to go down. So make sure you're always balancing this in the best way. I think it's kind of cool and unique, but I can imagine as more and more battles go on and on and on, it can probably get a little bit grinding. Always having to pull yourself out of a battle, especially if you're being hacked to pieces from every which way. And in the pit, that's definitely gonna happen. In this battle, I run out almost immediately. I get disarmed and I have to run around frantically trying to find a weapon on the floor before I get chopped down. However, I do manage to pick up a new weapon, and I hack and slash my way, and eventually me and my team get there. Weapons are constantly thrown into the battle, and it's really cool. Anything from pots and pans, barrels, from spears, shields, swords, pretty much anything you can imagine. They can all be thrown, they can all be hit, they can all be used to block. It's kind of an entertaining, almost that Chivalry 2 casual nature where it's a little bit of insanity, but it's all done for the purpose of fun. Wildcard is also a cool addition. Some missions that you go into will have a wildcard element, meaning that they have a little bit of a twist. The one I went into meant that you kept whatever weapons that you were holding when the game finished. So yeah, you can pick up weapons, arms and armor off the floor and make sure you're still holding it by the end, and you'll get to keep that yourself. You can then use it in other battles, or you can upgrade to something a little bit better. All this is pretty fascinating. I think for a one-man team, it's got a lot of promise. The game itself is priced reasonably. It's £20, and from what I've seen, people are really enjoying the amount of content it has to offer. For a one-man development team, I couldn't really ask for much more in terms of content, price, and, well, the actual refined feel of the game. But there's one big problem, and this is where it gets a little bit frustrating for me. Because all in all, I really want to love this game, but there's something kind of holding me back, and unfortunately it's probably the most important part, and that's the combat. I just don't think it works very well. The over-the-top look means that, yeah, you kind of have to have that lock on combat, but hey, it just doesn't feel good. It feels really clunky, and you're always missing hits. It feels a little bit like you're playing Quap. Remember that game where you controlled each individual limbs of a runner, and it just meant that your character would be all over the place? Controlling combat in this feels a bit like Quap. I love hectic games like Chivalry, where everyone's getting decapitated left, right, and center. But when it's this fiddly and you're always finding yourself facing the wrong way and trying to shift your character to turn in the right direction, or they're locked onto someone else that you didn't want them to be locked onto, and you have to press X to relock to someone else, and so on and so forth, it just takes away quite a bit of the fun from it. It's okay in 1v1s, locking onto one person and taking them down piece by piece, but when the game starts to advance to later levels, you get more and more people in the same arenas, it feels almost impossible. You get hit in the back and there's nothing you can really do about it because there's no fast spin around, there's no way to block behind you. Once you're locked onto a character, you have to kill them or lock onto someone else, which, you know, a few click of buttons, trying to wrench your character around with the weird mouse movements to try and get your character to follow. It's not great. Is it terrible? No, I don't think it is. I think it's definitely usable, and I can imagine people have a lot of fun with it. But for me personally, the combat is kind of the worst part of the game. Every single aspect, from the RPG element to the graphics to even the idea, is beautiful. The physics elements are really fun. But if the combat in a Gladiator game just isn't up to scratch, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to put into it. And it's not just me saying that. I think a lot of people really understand that. Most people are giving it positive reviews, which I would completely agree with, but with one caveat. The combat really needs a lot of work. It's inconsistent to the point of frustration. You'll lose many gladiators due to this. The combat is incredibly original, but I think this is one of those situations with sucking soup up a straw into my ass is original, but that doesn't make it good. There's a reason that people don't do combat like this. There's a reason that AAA titles stay away from this kind of movement-based combat with the link between mouse and keyboard, because it's really hard to get right, and even then it still doesn't feel quite as good as what we've had in the past. And this is not a AAA studio. This is one person. All the reviews seem to be saying the same thing. A very unique game. It's doing a lot of good, and people really, really want to support this. However, there are a lot of issues that need to be looked into with making the combat fun and playable, because I can imagine that is going to be the main thing that puts people off, especially if it's the main aspect of the title.